Hi, and welcome to MTC Slip, where we come together to talk about loss. So, Seinfeld isn't my favorite show, but it just so happened to be playing. But they started depicting the problems we all have with vending machines at some point. One of the characters put his change in, and the coil didn't release his candy bar, so he gets more change, and he goes back to get the candy bar. He's going to get two, and somebody else had already gotten both candy bars. And he pulls a Karen. He goes up to the manager, basically, because he's got this ongoing rivalry thing going, and with this guy working there. And he goes, "I at least want my 75 cents back and an apology because I know who did it." Okay. And that guy fired. And I went running up to my husband and I described the whole scene and I said, "Guess which one of the characters that had that scenario, guess which one it was?" And he goes, "George Costanza," without a beat. He just knew. He's a fan, but he knew his personality would be more prone to that situation. And the reason why he could pick out which character so quickly was not just because he was a fan, but because they specialize in that show with static characters, no personal growth, and very little development with very predictable personalities. So resentment wasn't just something he did or went through, it was part of his personality profile. And we as people, not scripted comedians in a TV show, drama, comedy show, don't have the benefit of just having resentment incorporated in our personality and getting a big kick out of it. We actually have to come to terms with the fact that resentment, when we've had loss in any area, but with child loss, we're dealing with easy resentment towards other people, possibly ourselves, because we're so vulnerable with what's happened with us. And as humans, we naturally want to do what George did. We want a little more than maybe we should for what was done to us or what we feel was done to us. And we went over that a little bit in our anger video. And we can kind of shine it up and hold on to it and not let it go. And that is a perfect depiction that George laid out for us, because we want more than just our 75 cents back. We want that guy fired too. And it's easy for us to slip into, which is why in the Old Testament of the Bible, we have this law that's in place that says an eye for an eye. And some people have depicted that as an overlording, angry, wrathful God who doesn't care. But I had a preacher break that down one time, because we're so much like George in that circumstance when things happen to us, that we would go past an eye for an eye almost every time without exception. And it was more of an act of mercy to put a limiter on what we feel like we should get in reparations for what's been done to us or around us, or what we feel like we've been through. And you can have that George reaction with anybody who's ignored your pain and left you out after a loss because they didn't want to talk about it, or said insensitive things about, well, at least it was early, or, well, you didn't have a baby yet, so that's good, or any of the crazy things I've heard lost parents say that they've gotten from people. We want more than just to say something back to them. We want more than that. And we have to change that if we're going to get healing done. So if we identify what resentment is, call it what it is, and take the steps that we need to take to resolve it, we can start healing from things that would otherwise consume us wholly. So the first step in identifying it, we have to get a real good definition of it, because the reason why I was so excited about the scene with George was I was already working on this topic and I couldn't figure out a great way to define resentment. And I even asked my husband, I said, define it for me. And he sat there and really thought about it. He tried, but I'm like, but you know what it is. You know absolutely when you see it or feel it, but you can't define it well. So I have some help here that we're going to use to define it. I went to the etymology dictionary online, which was very handy. It had the history of the word, the breakdown of its Latin roots. And the word sentire in Latin means to feel, which is the root word. And then it has that prefix re, which means again. So we're feeling the emotion over again, literally, if we break down the words. And then there was a 1943 psych definition that said it's a state arising from suppressed feelings of envy and hatred that cannot be acted upon. So they have more of a, it's a bubbling anger. It's on low simmer and it finally boils over. So then Merriam-Webster Dictionary says it's a feeling of indignant displeasure or persistent ill will at something regarded as a wrong, insult, or injury. And we've talked about anger in one of our videos. You can slip back to that one if you need to. There is anger that you have, and then there is the anger that when you've seen somebody retell a story where you've done it, they just keep getting that same reaction every time they talk about it. It's an emotional reoccurrence. And if it's clicking with you that you might be doing that to someone or to yourself, which is possible, you need to identify that's resentment. It's not just anger. Anger is quick. It's there. Sometimes it takes a little bit, but it's a reaction. This is a reoccurring reaction that sticks with us. And we talked a little bit about that in the anger video, but this also, I mean, goes on. This can be long lasting. This is extended. So if you have somebody that said something and every time you talk to them, you get angry again, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. If you did something and you think that maybe the loss was my fault, and every time you go to do that thing again, you're upset at yourself again, that would be an example. So identify it. And then the next step, you need to ask yourself, do I want to heal from it? Now, some of you just went, yeah, well, I want to, obviously. But not everybody thinks about the fact that we need to make that decision. I was doing a devotional. She started talking about the man by the pool, and I just watched literally that same night the scene in The Chosen where he goes up and Jesus heals the man that had been sitting lame by the pool because there was this pool that they thought, you know, these angels would come and stir the water, was the mythology behind it. And the first person in gets healed. So when he's sitting there, Jesus walks up to him and goes, do you want healed? And instead of just saying yes, he starts leaning into the fact, well, I don't have anybody. Nobody will carry me down. I'm never the first person there. And he goes into all of the things he's hanging on to, and it's hanging up and preventing him from healing. And I had that devotional that night that went into the same story, the Pool of Bethesda. And she said, you have to make that was the whole point of what Jesus asked him. You have to make that decision. You can hang on to things and decide not to heal from things. You can make the decision to just keep feeling that and make it part of your identity, like George did. That's part of George's identity almost on the show. It's just him. And I don't think anybody wants to be stuck there like that. I think we want to keep moving in a positive direction. I think that's something that we want to achieve, but sometimes we get stuck places and we have to make that decision to move forward. And once you do that, we can go on to forgiving those people we're talking about, us, other people, whoever. And we have the steps laid out in the anger video about forgiveness. If you want to go back and plug in and watch what the Bible says, the steps, and even if you're not a follower, perfect steps to go through with talking to the person and how to handle that. I see psychologists using the same steps that are in the Bible and they're not using it in a biblical way necessarily. They're just using the same structure because it's a good setup. We have those back in the other video if you need to go over those on forgiveness. But I want to hear, not just brush through forgiveness, but bring up the fact that if it's hard for you to think, I want to forgive that person, and it's like, as soon as you said this, you almost shut it off. I understand where you're coming from, but the idea that you just forgive and forget, that's so common in our social media, in America, just in general, it's not necessarily, if you were a Christian, that same principle. When what I mean by that, because even in the church, there's debate on it a little. You can forgive someone by canceling out the debt. So if George would have just said, fine, I'm good, you know, even if it was just a 75-cent swap or just forget the 75 cents, I'm understanding of the situation. If you cancel out that debt that they've enacted upon you, then it doesn't mean that you're not going to set boundaries. George wouldn't come back to that car lots vending machine. And he's learned his lesson. You know, that's kind of a place I won't go anymore. You can make those decisions so you don't get hurt again. It's different than just saying, it's not like you have to just pretend nothing happened. You can set firm boundaries in place and have appropriate actions that are followed through that make it so you're not getting at the same hurt again. You've learned something, you're using it in a positive way. Not that you're being spiteful, but simply that you want to move on in a positive direction and let that go so you can move on. And you might not get a thank you or I'm sorry or any of that. If you said, hey, I forgive you for that, nothing might happen on their end, but it's not meant for them. It can be great for them, but it's for you, because if you've got resentment and it's consuming you and it just doesn't let you get anything done and you get angry and you're going on and through it. We talked about it in the loneliness, where it's bad for your brain to keep going over those stressful events. You have to let that go for you too. It's something that's not just forget and cover and bury it. It's something that you're using it to learn what needs to be done or said differently or whatever. And it's used in a positive manner. So I just wanted to make sure I defined that, because when we get into some of these books that are like, yeah, just forgive and forget about it and don't ever worry about it again, that person didn't change necessarily. You might need to make steps so that you're not putting yourself in a position, or your family in position, or whatever, to deal with that event, because it can be a small thing or it can be huge. So I have a story from someone that I heard would demonstrate this in a great way, and I'm gonna just bulldog through this. You might know this story. The guy was named Joe. You might, and like I said, you might hear it and go, oh, okay, I remember this from somewhere. And he worked in a family business, and he wasn't so great at holding his tongue, which we all have our moments. And those guys probably gave it right back to him. But he doesn't go into that much. But he starts bragging a little bit. They're in the family business. And he's like, Dad really likes me. Look at all this cool stuff. And it must have been a long time coming, because his brothers have just had it. They're over it. They get so mad. They're like, we're getting rid of him. And intent to kill. They've got a hole ready, and they're all gamed up, got a game plan. And one of the brothers goes, wait a second. Whether he used this as a mercy thing or he was just wanting to profit off of it. It was in a different country, and there's rampant human trafficking. He goes, let's get some money off of this, since, it's a waste otherwise. So he gets trafficked to a different place completely from where he was at. And he goes to his boss. He does great there. He does good work. The boss kind of keeps him up in higher ranks and where he's working. And then he kind of gets into some situations because they're not so great people. And he ends up in jail for it. And then he makes some connections while he's there. That person gets out and ends up working for basically the president. And when the president is stumped and can't figure out, you know, how do I plan for this? I don't know what's going to happen. It seems like there's something I need to be prepared for, and nobody here is being helpful. The guy who was in prison with him that was his connection goes, I know somebody. And the president is super in charge. He gets to break him out and go, do you have an idea? I got told that you can help me here, and this is going to make me look bad if stuff goes the wrong way. And because he's got this experience and he knows what's up, the family business was farming, and they're talking about bringing in proper amounts of produce. He plans appropriately, looking at what's going on with some help, that this is the surplus you're going to have, and then you're probably going to go down after that. It's going to be a drought. You're going to have some issues. You need to store now, and then you save it for later. And nobody else had that concept except him. He does a great job. The president looks good because exactly what he said happens. And then when the drought is happening, all these people are coming to his country, his place to buy. They're getting wealth that wasn't going to be available in another circumstance. And then Joe, the guy that was in the family business who basically got sold and worked his way up the ranks, his family shows up in that place because of his planning, because they need to feed their livestock. They're going to die, and they need food for them. And he sees them, and he looks at them, and he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And he does a little bantering and kind of figures out where they're at and tries to see if they've had a change of heart, because I feel like we all want that. We want somebody to be apologetic for what's happened. And he must have sensed something, and he must have had these definitions in place where he identified it, and he wanted to heal, because then he comes out to his family and he goes, you know who I am? I'm the brother you sold. Take what you need. And a matter of fact, this lifestyle that I'm living, because he was basically like vice president at this point almost, he says, you come here, you share the lifestyle, because if you hadn't done the things you did and life didn't end up this way, it might be worse off. And it was such a positive way to look at it. It was such a good way to set up boundaries of, this happened, you didn't mean well for me, but it ended up being that I was able, and with God's help, to bring something good out of it. And that's a beautiful demonstration of the steps. And I think if somebody with all of those problems can have that kind of reaction, I think we can too after loss.